The next speaker is Paul Connett, Professor Paul Connett. He's Emeritus Professor of Environmental Chemistry at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. He's given over 2,500 pro bono public presentations around the world in incineration and waste management, and if you haven't read his book on zero waste, Paul has got a 10-point plan that is going to solve a huge problem for our environment. Fluoride is by no means his only area of interest. He wrote a book called The Case Against Water Fluoridation. Now, Paul is a chemist. His co-authors are a physicist, all three PhDs, I might add, a physicist, a biologist, and a chemist, presenting the case against fluoridation. So, with no further ado, I will introduce Paul Connett.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you all for being here today. As Ron has just said, actually hasn't said that, but I've been researching the issue of fluoridation for the last 19 years, first as a professor of chemistry specializing in environmental chemistry and toxicology, and now as the director of the Fluoride Action Network. And yes, this work largely culminated in 2010 with the publication of this book. And the most important thing about this book is it wasn't written by me. It was written by three of us, Dr. James Beck, MD, PhD, Professor of Physics, and he later went on to end fluoridation in Calgary in Alberta. And Professor Speddy Micklem got his doctorate from Oxford in biology. He taught at the University of Edinburgh. And they really made sure that this book was understated, not overstated, that every single fact was referenced to the scientific literature, 80 pages in all. And yet, despite this effort to raise the level of the debate, the other side didn't even engage from the safe distance of their offices. After 5 years, their fluoridation promoters have not produced a written scientific response to the arguments presented in this book. Had it been the other way around, we would have got a response in, I'm sure, within a few months, chapter by chapter, even sentence by sentence. But they don't have to do that because they have the power to keep this practice going. Fluoridation has fossilized, I believe, into a belief system. They don't have the science, that's why they can't debate. They don't have the science, that's why they can't respond in writing. So I will argue that fluoridation is unusual, is unnatural, is unethical, is unnecessary, unsafe, and ineffective. And that there are better ways to fight tooth decay, especially in low-income families. And that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start at the end with some good news. This good news, well, first of all, again to stress that most of the tooth decay in Western countries is concentrated in low-income families. And we need to target those families with better dental services, better dental education, and better diet. And that's precisely what they've done in Scotland. Instead of water fluoridation, the Scottish government instigated what they call their Child Smile program. And this involves, one, teaching toothbrushing to children at the earliest age, at the first school they go to, the nursery school. And in those same schools, they put an emphasis on healthy snacks. Get the sugary drinks out and bring in the fruit and vegetables and so on. And also to work with the parents. So what advances are made at the school are also being made in the home and reinforced in the home. And then in addition to that, every year each child gets an annual checkup, and if treatment is required, they get it. And that includes topical varnish treatment. So they're not against fluoride per se, they're just not putting it in the drinking water. The results have been remarkable. The proportion of children aged 4 to 6 without obvious decay has risen from 42% in 1996 to 67% in 2012. And for 10 to 12-year-olds, it's even more stark. from 53% in 2005 to 73% in 2013. They are ahead of schedule. And what's more, this has been a very cost-effective program. Researchers in Glasgow have found that the cost of treating dental disease in 5-year-olds has decreased by more than half between 2001 and 2010. In other words, if we're successful and we stop water fluoridation, it doesn't mean the end of the world, it doesn't mean chaos. And this is true not only in Scotland, but all over Europe where they don't have fluoridation. It also includes Japan. The message: our kids need more brushing, more fruit and vegetables, less sugar. And less sugar means not only less tooth decay, but less obesity. And so if you're worried about how much this is going to cost, it's worth every penny, because less obesity means less diabetes, fewer heart attacks, and so on. So it's a really good investment to put your effort into education, not fluoridation. Education, not fluoridation. So, the first argument then, fluoridation is unusual. The vast majority of countries do not fluoridate their water. That includes 97% of Western Europe. Over half the people drinking fluoridated water live in North America. The other big chunk of them come from English-speaking countries. This is an Anglo-American affair. It started in America, as you heard. Now, some of these countries fluoridate their salt, but that doesn't explain what you're going to hear in a moment. The vast majority of European countries neither fluoridate their water nor their salt. Now, fluoridation is unnatural. We heard about the natural levels in water. Well, the levels in water, it's nothing to do with biology, nothing to do with nature. It's the vagaries of which rocks the water has gone through, percolated through. The rocks came first. The rocks came before biology, before nature, before evolution. So that is not giving, if you like, finding water, fluoride naturally in some water supplies does not give you the notion that biology has approved this in any way. In fact, arsenic occurs naturally in some water supplies. It doesn't make it safe. So nature's verdict on the safety of fluoride is here. The level of fluoride in mother's milk, the baby's first meal, is extremely low. 0.004 parts per million. That's from the National Research Council report from 2006, page 40. You can check it out. I'll talk more about that report in a moment. So very, very low. In other words, mother's milk protects our babies from early exposure to fluoride. But water fluoridation removes nature's protection, because that baby, if it's bottle fed in Sydney, is going to get 250 times the level of fluoride in mother's milk. And I believe removing that protection from the newborn baby is reckless. Reckless. A bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community is getting between 175 to 300 times more fluoride than nature intended. In other words, by nature's standards, 1 ppm, 1 part per million, is not small, as the promoters of fluoridation insist. It is huge. It is huge. Now, another indication that nature doesn't particularly like fluoride is there's not one biological process in the body that uses fluoride. And there was nothing to prevent nature from using fluoride, because life evolved from the sea, where the fluoride concentration is 1.4 parts per million. And yet she didn't decide to use fluoride in any biological process, any biological function. And another way of saying that is that fluoride is not an essential nutrient. But on the other hand, there are many biological processes and components which are harmed by fluoride, enzymes, G proteins, and every week we seem to find another problem. So nature's excluding this fluoride from the baby does not, to me, appear an accident. It's keeping away from the baby a highly active substance, a highly biologically active substance. Fluoridation is unethical. We should never use the public water supply to deliver any medical treatment, and we haven't. We haven't since 1945, when fluoridation began in the United States. They've never, ever, anywhere in the world, used this approach of using the public water supply to deliver a medication. And for obvious reasons. Because once you put a medicine in the water, you can't control the dose, and you can't control who gets it. It goes to everybody. It goes from babies right the way through to elderly people. It goes to people who are sick. It goes to people that should definitely not get fluoride. People with poor kidney function. People with borderline iodine deficiency. But it goes to everybody. Because they like that. That means that you don't have to teach anybody to do anything. You get fluoride whether you want it or not, and it's going to do whatever it does without your help. They like that. But it also has this downside. It's going to people that definitely shouldn't get it, and there's no way of controlling the dose, because you can't control how much water people drink, or for that matter, how much fluoride they get from other sources. And finally, most important of all, it violates the individual's right to informed consent to medication. We're allowing communities, and in the case of some states like Ireland, Victoria, we're allowing the whole community or the whole state to do to everyone what an individual doctor can do to no one. It really surprises me that doctors are standing by and allowing the dental community to do this, because they're not allowed to. They could not force you to drink a glass of fluoridated water. It is unethical. It violates modern medical ethics. But who the hell cares about ethics, right? A few people, apparently, who are here today, but not much of the medical profession, apparently, in Australia and the United States. It's sad. Fluoridation is unnecessary. In 1999, the Centre for Disease Control, i.e. the Oral Health Division, which is about 30 dentists, dentally trained, they work very closely with the American Dental Association. They are the #1 promoter of fluoridation in the United States and the world. But they conceded that the predominant benefit of fluoride is topical, not systemic. Whoops! What they said is, in essence, that they've been getting this mechanism of fluoride's action wrong for about 50 years. This is exactly what they said. Fluoride's carries preventive properties. Initially, were attributed to changes in enamel during the tooth development that you heard from Ron. It's the teeth under the gums, before they've emerged into the oral cavity. The idea is to strengthen that enamel, so when the teeth come out, then they're more resistant to acid attack. But they went on. However, laboratory and epidemiologic research suggests that fluoride prevents dental caries predominantly after eruption of the tooth into the mouth, and its actions primarily are topical. Well, in my view, this admission by the #1 promoter of fluoridation in the world should have ended fluoridation, for obvious reasons. If fluoride works primarily on the surface of the tooth, and you've got fluoridated toothpaste universally available, it's very difficult to avoid fluoridated toothpaste. Why swallow it and expose every tissue of the body to a known toxic substance, where every day we see more risks being documented in the literature, when you could brush it on your teeth and spit it out? And why put it in the drinking water and force it on people who don't want it? It is the height, the utter height of arrogance to continue to force this on adults who are quite capable of buying fluoridated toothpaste and quite capable of moving their arms backwards and forwards. Maybe you could force it on people that don't have any arms. Fluoridation is unsafe. This is an amazing document. This is the National Research Council report, Fluoride in Drinking Water, a scientific review of EPA's safe drinking water standards, and it was commissioned by the US EPA. They paid a lot of money to have this done, not that they've done much with the recommendations that were made, but it's important to recognize that this is a very unusual review. It was carried out by a balanced panel. They had 3 people on there that were pro-fluoridation, 3 that were anti-fluoridation, and 6 who were uncommitted. That is a very rare event in this history. Most pro-fluoridation governments select pro-fluoridation panels to rubber stamp their policy, which is exactly what Australia does every few years with the National Health and Medical Research Council. It took this panel 3.5 years to complete this massive review. It's really the Bible of toxicology on fluoride. It was 500 pages long and had 1,100 references. And it was dismissed in one sentence by the NHMRC in 2007 as not being relevant to water fluoridation in Australia. They said that they looked at levels between 2 and 4 parts per million, and in Australia we fluoridate between 0.6 and 1.2. However, if these reviewers had actually read the report, they would have found a figure on page 85. I do urge you to actually go and look at that figure. And that figure shows that bottle-fed babies in fluoridated communities at 1 part per million are exceeding the EPA's safe reference dose for fluoride. So how can you say that this report is not relevant to Australia when you've got this figure? These dots represent the average fluoride intake from all sources, where the water level is 1 part per million. And this is ages across the board. And that dot at the top is non-nursing infants, and it was bottle-fed infants. The red line is the safe reference dosage. Obviously, this report was highly relevant to water fluoridation. Now, the dental fluorosis rates indicate that American children are being hugely overexposed to fluoride, and we have reasons to believe that's the case also in Australia and New Zealand, although your surveys are pretty weak, not very scientific, not very frequent, not very comprehensive. But 41% of all American children aged 12 to 15 now have some form of dental fluorosis, which is 4 times higher than they were anticipating when this practice began. And it looks like this, 41%, 28.5% have very mild, 8.6% have mild, and 3.6% have moderate or severe. The latest survey, which has not yet been published, but the results are available, shows moderate. The kids, we now have about 20% with moderate dental fluorosis. That's 100% of the enamel impacted. This is what it looks like. This is very mild, up to 25% of the tooth surface impacted, mild up to 50%, moderate 100%, and severe 100% of the surface indicated. But this is what you can see. And what I'm concerned about is what about the things that you can't see? When fluoride is damaging by some biochemical mechanism, the laying down of the enamel, what's it doing to other tissues? What's it doing to the bone cells? What's it doing to the brain cells? What's it doing to the endocrine system? It would be reckless to assume, which is what they've done for 70 years, that nothing else is impacted. And the way they protect that assumption is that they don't do very many health studies in places like Australia. You can count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of health studies other than teeth that have been performed in Australia. It's a good way of protecting yourself, but it's political protection, it's not scientific protection. In part B of my presentation, which will come later, I'll talk about the numerous studies which indicate that fluoride damages the brain. Fluoridation is ineffective. There's been no randomized controlled trial after 70 years. And just to put that so you know what we're talking about here, a randomized controlled trial is the gold standard of epidemiology. This is what the FDA will do for every drug except the most prescribed drug in American history, namely fluoride. The FDA has never regulated fluoride for ingestion. Unbelievable. And their official description of fluoride is an unapproved drug. So as a result, no RCTs. The World Health Organization data. According to the WHO data, the tooth decay rates in 12-year-olds is coming down as fast in non-fluoridated as fluoridated countries. And Ron gave you only half the story. If you look at that half of the story, say, oh, look here, the fluoridation is wonderful. Look at the other half of the equation and see that tooth decay rates in 12-year-olds are coming down as fast, if not faster, in the non-fluoridated countries. If you put the lot together, you cannot tell the difference. And if you look at the data after 2000, it's a wash. You can't tell whether that 12-year-old is growing up in a fluoridated or a non-fluoridated country. This is the largest study ever carried out in the United States. It was carried out by a pro-fluoridation entity, the National Institute of Dental Research. They looked at 39,000 children in 84 communities. In Table 6, you see a comparison between tooth decay for children aged 5 to 17 who'd always lived in a fluoridated community versus a non-fluoridated community. And they measured decayed, missing, and filled surfaces. That jacks up the sensitivity from DMFT by about a factor of 4 to 5. So if a child always lived in a fluoridated community in this data, they had 2.8 decayed, missing, and filled surfaces. If they'd always lived in a non-fluoridated community, they had 3.4. If you subtract one from the other, then you see that the saving, the grand saving of a lifetime exposure, at least the average, from 5 to 17, was 0.6 of one tooth surface out of about 100 tooth surfaces in a child's mouth. And they didn't even show that this minuscule saving was statistically significant. They didn't report the statistics. Okay, I'm just almost finished. The most precise study of tooth decay. That was the biggest. This is the most precise. Warren and co-workers looked at children from birth. They measured or estimated how much fluoride they were getting in milligrams per day and looked at their tooth decay. And what they concluded was there was no obvious relationship between how many milligrams per day a kid swallowed and how many milligrams per day and their tooth decay. These findings suggest that achieving a caries-free status may have relatively little to do with fluoride intake. So summarizing, fluoridation is unusual. Most countries do not do it, and yet there's no obvious difference in tooth decay. It's unnatural. The level of fluoride in mother's milk is extremely low, and it's reckless to remove that protection. It's unethical. It violates the individual's right to informed consent. It is unnecessary. If it works at all, it works topically, which is incidentally one of the conclusions from the Warren study I just mentioned. And it's unsafe. We'll hear about lowered IQ shortly. And it's ineffective. There are better alternatives. The Child Smile program in Scotland is an example. And fluoridation is an obsolete practice, and it is time to end it, and it is ending. 170 communities in Australia, Canada have stopped since 2010. Add one more from yesterday. Montello in Wisconsin stopped fluoridation yesterday. Queensland lifted mandatory fluoridation in 2012. Israel ended fluoridation in Israel last year. And all over Ireland, communities are voting to have fluoridation, asking their federal government to stop mandatory fluoridation. And most of them are voting unanimously for that. And yesterday, the Arkansas House voted to remove the mandatory requirement for fluoridation. The bill is now going to the Senate. There's lots of resources. Let me just say you can get this. This is free online. You can get my book. And if you go to our webpage, you'll find a large amount of resources. This is the largest health database in the world. We have a videotape, professional perspectives on water fluoridation. That's 15 scientists. 10 facts on fluoride. That's 10, 20 minutes from my son. Interview with Chris Bryson, John Cahoon, Harley, etc., etc., etc. Fan TV. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for keeping on time. Wow, I've set a real precedent here. I can feel the excitement in the room already. We're going to be on time. So we've got a roving mic here, and we do have, as I mentioned, we do have other panellists here as well, and you know, I certainly welcome the comments of our guest panellists. As I remind you, Professor Bruce Neal and Pri Bandara and Charles Cranfield. So, are there any questions? Okay, I'm just going to bring the mic over. Just one second. And Paul, if you could stand, we want to record there.
Okay.
Hello?
Hi.
Yes. We have a lot of tests being done in Australia where...
Speak up a bit. No, it is on. Mic's on, so speak that.
Okay. Where we found fluorosis already in the people's teeth before they put fluoride in. Now, we've had that in a couple of cases in New South Wales, and some of those tests that were done found that they had this fluoride already causing fluorosis. Now, that comes from food sources, I would say, because when we look, we have got databases in Australia and from the United States Agriculture Department, where the foods are listed on 400 odd foods in each one of those studies done by Food Standards Australia, and they indicated, if you look at the average food intake of a person's meal, you would get to somewhere around maybe 4 to 8 parts per million of fluoride from the food sources. Now, this must have an impact on the bone diseases and so on that we're getting from fluoride from water sources as well.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to also elaborate on whether or not fluorosis is existing before they do any introduction of fluoride, and also how much do you believe and how much have you seen that's in the food sources, and what is the limit? What is the limit for the health limit of fluoride in this circumstance, whether it's above a certain level, like 4 parts per million?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. You have to be very careful with concentrations. You cannot add up concentrations. You cannot look at a list of concentrations in food and then just add them together and say the total is 4 parts per million, unfortunately. Your general point is correct, but basically what you have to do is to work out how many cornflakes you eat, how many sprouts you eat, and then multiply the concentration by the weight in kilograms that you are eating a day. In other words, the concentration is given in milligrams per kilogram. So if you multiply the number of cornflakes, or the amount of cornflakes you add by the number of kilograms that you eat, then you get the number of milligrams per day. And that's you would have to do that for each food source. Now the overall concern is right. We're getting fluoride from many more sources today than we did when fluoridation began. The obvious one, of course, is dental products. And kids swallow toothpaste. They get a lot of fluoride from that, or can do. Some kids actually eat toothpaste, so that's a real problem. Another thing is that fluoride is not only in pesticides, but it's also in fertilizers. When we use phosphate fertilizers, we get quite a bit of fluoride. One of the huge concerns that we now have in the United States is that Dow Chemical has introduced a fumigant called sulfuryl fluoride. I think you may have it here in Australia as well. And we fought very hard to stop that being used. In fact, we had an 8-year campaign, eventually threatened legal action. The EPA cut it off and said, we accept all your objections. And then the Dow lobby orchestrated a bill in Congress which overrode the EPA on that. But the levels which we are allowing in processed foods, for example, and wheat, is huge. I mean, I think it's 130 parts per million is allowed in wheat, which is pizzas, it's cake, it's cookies, and so on. And so our kids now have this extra source. So you still have, when we compare, we still have higher rates of dental fluorosis in fluoridated communities than non-fluoridated communities, but the rates of dental fluorosis in non-fluoridated communities, what you're talking about, is increasing with all these other sources. And when you have here what Bill Hersey has to say about the safety of fluoride as far as lowering IQ is concerned, we're not just going to have to stop water fluoridation. We're going to have to stop the use of fluoridated toothpaste and try to get into some of these other sources as well. It's very serious, it's very urgent, and you'll hear about that later.
Priya's just going to make a comment.
I would like to make a comment before asking a question. Introducing myself again, Priyanka Bandare. I'm a researcher and an educator in environmental health. I've got a very big interest in preventable chronic diseases and the environmental impact on those. And I'm very interested in this issue. I've got a 10-year-old son with what I would say moderate to severe fluorosis. His teeth are badly mottled. With this sort of public health initiatives, clearly there has to be a multidisciplinary approach, and it appears that that has been perhaps lacking in water fluoridation. Now, has Paul or Ron, either one can answer my question now. Has there been any studies done looking at bone health, say, you know, the fracture rate, or even you mentioned neurotoxic effects, you know, maybe perhaps prevalence of neurodegenerative disorders, or in childhood neurobehavioral disorders, and looked at the levels of fluoride in, perhaps in, I don't know, blood, or if they can be measured easily. I don't know whether serum fluoride levels is a good indication, or taking fluorosis as an indicator of body accumulation. Are there any studies?
Thank you. Very good question. In very simple terms, you can divide the world of fluoridation research into two parts. The countries which have high natural levels of fluoride, who have serious health problems, and they do genuine research to try to find out what level you need to reduce the fluoride levels in naturally occurring. And then you have the countries which practice fluoridation. They have made no genuine attempt to study the issue, and doing the basic kind of things that, and obviously somebody who knows something about toxicology or epidemiology would ask for. Where have you made comprehensive tests of the levels of fluoride in people's urine, in people's blood, in people's bones? Are you tracking these levels to see if there's any accumulation in the bone? In fact, the National NHMRC in 1991 recommended that Australian health authorities do that, and they haven't done it. They've never done that. So there's no really attempt to do the basic. And then you go to another basic, which is when you know that there's a non-invasive way of measuring exposure in a child. I think everybody agrees that the severity of dental fluorosis is an indicator of how much exposure, a good quantitative measure of how much exposure to fluoride the kid has had before their permanent teeth have erupted. So the obvious thing to do then is to use this easy, non-invasive way of determining sets of children at different fluoride exposure levels, and then ask questions like, what is the fracture rate? What is the age to puberty? What is the IQ? What is their behavior like in class? Or all these basic questions which could have been addressed in literally thousands. We got thousands and thousands of children with no dental fluorosis, thousands and thousands of children with very mild, thousands and thousands with mild, thousands with moderate. We've got the perfect setup if you had health agencies with integrity to look at this issue. But they don't look at it through scientific eyes, they look at it through political eyes. In other words, they work backwards, for they do what is necessary to keep this practice going. And to keep this practice going, it means your science is wonky. But fortunately, we have very good studies coming out of China on bones, very good studies coming out of China on neurodevelopment, ditto with India, ditto with Iran, ditto with Mexico. And instead of repeating these studies, what we do in Australia, New Zealand and Ireland is to attack the methodology or attack the researcher or attack the journal that they appear in. Everything but attempt to do the research yourself. It's very distressing. I can't tell you how distressing this issue is for somebody who believes in science. You probably think I'm very emotional, but part of that emotion is to see what I believe in. I believe that the issue should fall where the science falls. Let the science be the ultimate judge here. But that is not allowed. And I don't believe in science any issue should be put beyond debate, which is what they have been doing for years and years and years. And one of the sad things of putting this issue beyond debate, ridiculing and harassing people that do actually speak out on this, and one of our panelists is being harassed right now in New Zealand, Stan Leaches, for having the guts to speak out on this issue. One of the results of that is that they're not teaching doctors at medical school anything about fluoride's toxicity. They're not taught about the first symptoms of fluoride's effect on people that are very sensitive to fluoride. This isn't healthy, people. This is not healthy. So if you believe in science and you believe it's important for the public to trust their health agencies, then for goodness sake help us end this foolish practice as soon as possible. Because it's hurting. It's hurting science, it's hurting health, and I would say, I would go one step further, it's hurting democracy. Because the other group that are not doing their job, the professional bodies are not doing their job properly on this, the health agencies are propagandists, not scientists, and the media is letting this happen.
Thanks, Paul. Bruce, Professor Neil, would you like to add anything?
Sure. So my name's Bruce Neal. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Sydney. I'm not expert in fluoridation.
A bit closer to the microphone.
So I'm not expert in fluoridation, but what I am expert is in research and policy. So I guess, you know, the first comment I would make is that sitting here, I'm sort of not quite sure sometimes whether I'm at a scientific meeting or at a religious convention. I mean, there's so much passion here, but I have a real problem, I guess, because there's no doubt that you know, you're on the fringe. Now, you could be on the fringe because actually your views are pretty fringe, or you could be leading the pack, which is clearly what Paul thinks, and either of those are possibilities. But from what I've seen today in these presentations, the question I have is, why are the conclusions you're drawing so different to the conclusions that 95% of the other people working in this space, commenting in this space and writing reports in this space are drawing? Because it seems to me you've all got access to the same science. With all due respect, I don't think it's likely that you're a much better scientist than the hundreds of other people who have reviewed the data. So that, you know, really is my question, is why should I, and why should everyone else here, I mean, everyone else here probably going to be easier to convince, but why should the rest of the community and the policymakers believe you rather than the hundreds of other people and the many tens of other reports out there, which really, you know, when it comes down to it, say, you know, on balance, the totality of the evidence viewed in a sort of systematic, balanced way says probably fluoridation of the water prevents tooth decay in one form or another. And it's unlikely that fluoridation of the water is causing serious harm on the basis of the evidence available. So that really is the question, and that's the problem I have sitting there listening to, frankly, an almost evangelical presentation, not a scientific presentation.
Yeah, well, I tried to explain why I'm fairly emotional about that. If you think that's evangelical, well, that's unfortunate. But the reason that you, I think, should pay a little attention to what I have to say is that I didn't want this issue. I thought the people opposed to fluoridation were a little nutty. when my wife persuaded me to look at this 19 years ago. So I had an open mind. If anything, I wanted to find as quickly as possible a way out of doing this. But I presented to you some of the startling facts which are just glossed over by the other side. I think a startling fact, for example, is the level in mother's milk. I think it's startling that we're forcing people to drink something when no scientist has ever shown that there's anything in the body that needs it. And even they are now accepting that it works primarily topically. Why should you listen to me? Answer is because I am prepared to go out on a public platform and present the arguments and defend them. I am prepared with colleagues to write a whole book on this, with everything documented. And if you think I'm evangelical here, then read my book. Because I had 2 other scientists moderating that tendency to fight injustice, to fight stupidity and foolishness and unprofessionalism. That makes me angry. I've tried to explain what makes me angry. I believe in science, and yet I'm portrayed as junk science. I believe in science, but they want to portray me as a propagandist. They, on the other hand, are behaving like propagandists. And let me give you one example. I'm sure you would be really impressed with the credentials of Sir Peter Glickman, Chief Scientific Advisor of the New Zealand Prime Minister, and Sir Richard Skegg, who is the President of the Royal Commission of Science in New Zealand. They reviewed this and gave the kind of results that you've seen in other dummy reviews by pro-fluoridation panels. They came back and they talked about the IQ studies. And what did they do with the review of the IQ studies? They referred to the Harvard review, and they said this Harvard review only found a drop of half an IQ point. And I looked at that and I said, oh my God. It wasn't half an IQ point, it was half a standard deviation, which was 7 IQ points. Now, it wasn't that they made a mistake. The problem was that that mistake came about by propagandists in the United States who set out to spin this Harvard review. And they were the ones that were propagating that it was only half an IQ point and nothing to worry about. And it disturbs me that 2 years after this propaganda had been dispelled in the media, that these distinguished people say they reviewed the literature on IQ effects and assure the New Zealand population that there's no problem, like 95% of your scientists that you think are the majority, and yet it's based upon propaganda. Now, I'm not used to having propaganda from these prestigious bodies or from health agencies. I think that the bureaucrats, the civil servants, should be giving us objective science. They shouldn't be spinning it. And just to have a look at this, just a second. This, according to Queensland Health, is teeth of somebody exposed to fluoridated water. This, according to Queensland Health. Now, this is civil servants.
Stay within the microphone.
Yeah, these people are being paid by the taxpayer now to give objective truth. This was on a postcard that was sent to the MPs before they voted for mandatory fluoridation in Queensland. Now, that's what makes me angry. That makes me angry. That is just propaganda, because what you're looking at there is baby bottle tooth decay. And fluoridation does not stop baby bottle tooth decay. That is it's caused by abuse of the system, where babies suck on sugared water, Pepsi Cola or milk, fruit juice for hours on end. The tongue protects the bottom teeth when they're sucking on their teeth, but the tongue doesn't protect the top teeth, so they rot to the gums. Now, for civil servants to send that to politicians, claiming that that's what happens if you don't fluoridate the water, is dishonest propaganda.
Okay, well, I will allow, I think this is exactly what I was hoping we would have here. And it clearly is a very emotive issue. And I mean, when you're fighting the campaign and looking at the science, you know, it's frustrating. both as a practitioner and as a scientist, and the public, you can imagine. So this is, I'd like to encourage this. Ray, Bruce, I'll let you respond, and I'll let Professor Ray Kearney.
First of all, Paul, I applaud your passion, and what you've presented is commendable. I remind the good professor here that Semmelweis in the 1980s observed that physicians who didn't wash their hands were responsible for the infection in childbirth. He lost his job. Might I remind the good professor that in the 1940s, the medical profession promoted the choice of brand to smoke, Camel. Might I also remind the good professor that tonsils and adenoids were taken out in the early 40s, long before the evidence was shown that tonsils and adenoids were part of an immune network responsible for mucosal immunity. We need to put on the table the facts, and I applaud Paul for doing that. Let me remind you that the famous astrophysicist Stephen Hawking observed the real reason or the real risk to knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. The illusion of knowledge. They who know not and know not that they know not are fools. I applaud you, Paul.
Yeah. Please, let me not be judged on the emotional level of voltage of my presentation. Let me be judged on the scientific studies that I am presenting to support my conclusions. Now, it should be interesting to the professor to note that all the studies that I cited on the ineffectiveness of tooth decay were from pro-fluoridation sources. So that's why we should take them very seriously. From the World Health Organization that promotes fluoridation, from the National Institute for Dental Research that promotes fluoridation, from the people in Iowa who are all pro-fluoridation. And this is particularly true when we get to the second part. Judge what we have to say on the basis of the science. This is going to be particularly true with the evidence of neurotoxicity. And for your, I think you should know that there have been practically no decent reviews of neurotoxicity by any review panel in the world.
Okay, now let's keep our questions brief, because I think we've got obviously a very interesting discussion going on here, and a lot of passion, which is fine.
Yeah, I'd like to take some of the passion away if I can. My name is Dr. Charles Cranfield. I'm a senior lecturer here at UTS, and coming in today I had no opinion whatsoever about fluoride in water at all. I was sitting on the fence. I hoped to learn something about it. I just wish to query a couple of points you've made. So the mother's milk one, which I have a bit of a problem with. Are you suggesting that there's actually an evolutionary element to mother's milk not passing fluoride through?
I think it's quite possible. I think the mother's breast in this case is acting like a filter, because they have done studies. Eklund in Sweden.
Certainly mother's milk, there's a filter there, but do you think it's specifically for fluoride? Is my question.
No, let's put it this way. You give a mother more fluoride and you see the increase in the bloodstream, but you don't see the increase in the breast milk. So suggesting
understandably, but that's just the way that the system works. But it's not because of fluoride, though. Is my point. And to say it's unnatural, I don't see the link. If you see what I'm saying, it's not an evolutionary thing. Specifically for fluoride.
I'm a great respecter of nature. Okay, and it seems to me if there was any need for fluoride in the human body, if there was any need for it, the one place you would find it would be in mother's milk. Especially when you realize that during evolution, there was no shortage of fluoride for nature to draw upon, because she evolved from the sea, which had 1.5 parts per million. So I think it's very significant it's extremely low, and I think it's very significant that if you bottle feed a kid, you're giving that baby so much more fluoride than a breastfed baby. I think
but that's not to suggest that fluoride is necessarily bad in either way, though. Even if there's, because there is fluoride in the environment, as you said already, and there's fluoride in many water sources.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
So it's not to suggest that fluoride is necessarily bad, though, because there's, as you said already, there's fluoride in many water sources. I'm still not convinced about that argument. But anyway, I wish to move on.
There's also
the other part.
wait a minute. There's also arsenic in many water sources. So what are you saying? Because something occurs because water flowing through certain rocks picks up fluoride, that it suddenly becomes natural or okay when water...
It's not automatically bad either. I mean, arsenic is bad, we know that,
but I think...
necessarily fluoride might not necessarily be bad. But I wish to move on. Okay. The other point you make is that often fluoride is forced upon us, or it's forced into our water supply without our consent. But then again, I don't get taxed with my consent either, so I'm just a bit worried about that argument.
Well, wait a moment. It's a medical treatment. You are giving this you're putting this substance in the water to treat people. You're fighting a disease. You're either preventing, mitigating, or trying to reverse a disease. And you as a doctor should be aware...
I'm not a medical doctor. So
but you are aware of the principle of informed consent.
Yes.
Is that an important medical ethic or not?
No, I'll grant you that. Yep. My other part is that, so you showed a whole lot of down slopes with countries that don't have fluoride in their water. But all those countries, if I'm not mistaken, do use fluoride in toothpaste. So yes. Are you against fluoride in toothpaste?
No.
Good. That's all I need to know. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe 2 more questions, but I did see a question up here. Okay.
Hello, my name's Anthony. My background is as a pharmacist, so I have more than a passing interest in the effects of medication. My question is, I'd like Dr. Connett to speak to the issue of the type of fluoride that's actually used in our water, because in my industry, whenever we substitute not so much the active ingredient, but even just the brand, we have to ask people's consent. As I understand, and Professor Connett can correct me if I'm wrong, with water fluoridation, the people who are responsible for fluoridating our water can use any of a number of fluoridating agents. And it seems to me that you can't expect to have exactly the same effect by using different chemicals on the body, whether it be for the purposes of protecting teeth, but also in terms of the effects of the body, side effects, so on. So, if you could speak to that issue?
Yeah. 3 chemicals are used to fluoridate the public water supply. One is sodium fluoride, that in the United States about less than 10% of the water authorities use sodium fluoride. The other 2 are silicon fluorides, either hexafluorosilicic acid, H2SiF6, or the sodium salt of hexafluorosilicic acid, Na2SiF6. These silicon fluorides are derived from the phosphate fertilizer industry. When you take phosphate rock, which is insoluble in water, and make phosphate fertilizer, or phosphoric acid to use in industry, you treat it with concentrated sulfuric acid. And that drives off 2 very, very toxic gases, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. And for years, those gases decimated the vegetation in the area of these plants, and eventually they were forced to put wet scrubbers on, a spray of water. And that spray of water converts the hydrogen fluoride and the silicon tetrafluoride into hexafluorosilicic acid. And those scrubbers are circulated until you reach about 23% hexafluorosilicic acid. Now, they can't dump that into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's too concentrated. But in the United States, if you're a company producing hazardous waste, which is what this is, it's hazardous waste, if somebody buys it from you, it drops the hazardous waste classification, it becomes a product. So that's what's happening when the public water supply buys this chemical, it becomes a product. And then the answer to pollution is dilution. We take this chemical, 23% hexafluorosilicic acid, and dilute it down about 200,000 to 1. And in the process, the hexafluorosilicate ion dissociates, an equilibrium. And so you end up with a solution of hydrogen ions, fluoride ions, and hydrated silica. And then when they neutralize that with sodium hydroxide to bring the pH back to about 7, then the hydrogen ions are removed. And so essentially what you've got is a solution of sodium fluoride and hydrated silica. And they say this is the same as the stuff that we've done all the testing on, sodium fluoride solution, and therefore it's okay. We've done the testing. However, they gloss over the fact that in addition to hexafluorosilicic acid, you've got arsenic, you've got lead, you've got all kinds of contaminants which are also in this sulfate rock, including uranium. They mine the same phosphate rock in Florida for uranium. And some of these substances, like arsenic, and Bill Hosey here has done a risk assessment on it, some of these are known human carcinogens for which there's no safe level. So basically, you are, by using these industrial grade chemicals, you are increasing the cancer rates in the countries that you're fluoridating. There's no question about it. We can argue about if it's big or small and whether that's acceptable or not as a trade-off against reduced tooth decay, if indeed it works. But that is the reality. Now there's another issue about citizens will argue, well, this is not the calcium fluoride. When fluoride occurs naturally, it's calcium fluoride. No. When fluoride appears in your ions, in your water, from rocks, it means the water has passed through a number of rocks. And some of those rocks are producing positive ions and negative ions, a whole mixture. And quite often you'll find that where you've got naturally occurring fluoride, you've got high levels of calcium. And to a certain extent, it appears that when you drink fluoride in the presence of a large excess of calcium, the calcium mitigates the toxicity, probably either by forming an outright precipitate of calcium fluoride, which is going to end up in the feces, or by forming calcium monofluoride, CAF, with a single positive charge on it. And it's quite possible, although I haven't seen the studies, that this ion is less able to cross the gut. But for whatever reason, there are a number of studies which shows that fluoride in the presence of an excess calcium is not so toxic.